Section 3 of Rambles in New Zealand by Carne Bidwill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswax Candle. February 24th. The character of the country in this day's march began entirely to change. After a few miles the fern completely vanished and was replaced by a short, wiry grass growing in tufts about a foot high. The road was level, although we were surrounded by hills at no great distance. These were generally quite barren to the very tops. There was, however, a remarkable exception on our right. This was a long mountain called the Horohoro. Its direction was about southwest, and it formed the boundary of the plain as perfectly as if it had been a straight wall, which it in some degree resembled. It was, in fact, a perpendicular wall of basaltic rock, rising to about 2,000 feet from the surface of the plain, perfectly level on the top, and covered with trees, and then suddenly descending perpendicularly for about half its height, and presenting a straight bare wall of rock, rising as it were out of the top of a long, steep, thickly wooded hill. It was one of the most wonderful as well as the most picturesque objects I ever saw. Our road lay parallel with it, and at the end passed round its base. We had crossed several small streams during the morning, and here met with one about 10 yards across and 2 feet deep, which, like all the small rivers I have seen in this country, appeared to have no valley, but to have its course excavated perpendicularly out of the plain to a great depth. After crossing the stream, we had a curious place to ascend on the other side, the path leading up a very steep ridge of hard earth, not above a foot wide, formed apparently by the river making a very sharp turn just at that place, so as on one side of the ridge to be running in very nearly a contrary direction to the other. There I found a new use for my friend the chief. It began to rain very hard, and as Rangionair and I were ahead of the rest, I should have been thoroughly drenched, had it not been for a plan of his. I sat down on the earth, and he stood up behind me, stooping over my head and holding out his mat, and seeming just as much diverted at the ridiculous figure we cut as I was. However, it answered the required purpose famously, and as there was nobody else to laugh at us, I did not care. As we went on, the land became more and more barren and level, till it became a mere moor, without a shrub and almost without vegetation, a few bushes of the miserable-looking dracophyllum being all that occurred to break the monotony of the plain. I discovered here an extraordinary composite little plant, so small that I took it for a lichen. It grew in flat, hard grey patches and did not rise higher than 1/4 of an inch. The patches were in general winding, and I am convinced the sharpest-eyed botanist would have first mistaken them as I did. I afterwards found another but larger specimen of the same plant, growing near the limits of snow on the mountains. As we approached the Waikato, the grass began to improve, especially when we left the plains and entered the narrow valleys, in which some of it was equal, if not superior, to any of the best forest lands of New South Wales. One plant also of the dandelion family became very abundant, and I think would be an acquisition to any pastures even at home, as it would be in perfection in that part of the summer when most grasses are withered. 'Tis narrow grass-like leaves which grow in thick upright tufts, not spreading, like most plants of the family. Its taste was equal to lettuce. We crossed a large river within about a mile of its junction with the Waikato. It was above 30 yards wide and about 5 feet deep. Immediately on leaving its banks, the road passed through a narrow valley, at the other end of which was a remarkable rock, which the natives said was formerly a very strong pa. It appeared as if an immense mass, almost as square as a die, had been pitched from a distance at the top of a small hill, into which one of its corners had stuck. How it came there must be left to conjecture, for it does not appear to belong to any of the adjacent mountains. It is altogether about 800 feet high, and the rock on the top composes about half the whole mass. I saw it afterwards from all sides, and can hardly imagine how anyone could ever get to the top, much less how a village could have existed there. As we emerged from the valley, we saw that the rock was on the other side of the Waikato, which here runs rapidly through a small barren plain of about 20 miles long, hemmed in at each end by narrow gorges. We travelled some miles along the plain to seek a good place for encampment, but did not meet with any wood till 9 at night, and then could only get a few stunted karawaka or karuka bushes to make a fire with. The soil was so thin that bushes 5 feet high came up with a slight pull of the hand. It was entirely broken pumice, large masses of which lined the sides of the river. The first night I spent on the banks of this river was so intensely cold that I could not sleep. At 9 next morning, February 25, the thermometer stood at 39 in the tent. This cold could not be caused by the elevation of the country, as the barometer at the same time was only 29.40. The morning was bright and sunshiny. After this I had frequent reason to observe the great chilliness of the climate of the interior, the range of the thermometer being rarely above 60 at 1 o'clock in those parts of the country where the barometer indicated a mean of about 29 inches, and this too in the middle of summer, or rather in what ought to correspond with our July and August. The natives told me that in the winter there was often snow on all this part of the country, and that on the hills around, which were not by any means to be called mountains, it often lay for a week together. In fording a river tributary to the Waikato, I was rather startled to find that although the water was intensely cold, yet I could not stand still because the sand at the bottom burnt my feet. On one side was a patch of hot earth and a pool of hot water, but I had no idea of anything more. The fact was that the water at the side was the smallest portion of the hot spring, by far the greater quantity discharging itself through the bed of the river. We constantly passed near places where there appeared to have been springs formerly, and often there was steam hissing from slight fissures in the rock which might be passed unnoticed. One in particular was under a small waterfall, and I should never have discovered it had it not been that I thought the water made a most extraordinary noise, which I found was caused by the water pouring down on the very hole from which the steam escaped. We arrived on the last bank of the Waikato on Saturday evening, and rested the greater part of the following day, after which we went about 3 miles down the river in a canoe, and found a temporary encampment of natives belonging to the great Waikato tribe, who had come there for the purpose of catching crawfish, shellfish, etc., and snaring ducks and shags, which were very abundant. My natives took care not to find these people till it was near the evening, as they thought, if I did, I should go on as soon as I reached the other side of the river, although it was Sunday. The next day we again embarked in a small leaky canoe, and dropped about 2 miles further down the river, and landed on the other side, just at the head of some rapids, which prevent further navigation for about 2 miles. At this place the road, which we had almost lost sight of for several miles, became again quite distinct, and we set off along it for Taupo. At the head of these rapids the river is fordable. We found about 200 natives in temporary huts. I could not find out what brought them there. They said it was to make flax, which grew there in great abundance, but in other parts of the Waikato country, which I have seen, it has been much more abundant. The road for about 10 miles from the river was very hilly and barren, and lay often through narrow valleys hemmed in with perpendicular rocks, so as to look something like the deep cuts on the railroads at home. There were numerous deep holes in the ground, which would have rendered the road very dangerous at night. I suppose them to have been formerly the sites of hot springs. We passed through this bad road, and after about a mile of wood, emerged on a gently undulating plain surrounded by mountains in the distance. The land was better than the generality of fernland, but not good. However, there was abundance of water and great capabilities of improvement. At the edge of a wood which forms a belt between the Waikato and Taupo, of about 5 miles average width, we found a small settlement where about 50 acres were in potatoes. They said that maize would not grow there. At all events, they had none planted. They roasted some Swedish turnips and afterwards dressed them in a copper mori. I refused to eat any at first, but tasted a bit and found it excellent, although the smell was disagreeable. The soil is very rich here, but after 1 or 2 crops of potatoes it becomes worn out. I am not certain whether the natives meant that maize would not grow in this part of the country in ordinary seasons, because they said this was one of unusual severity. Temperature at 1 p.m. 55. Barometer 28 and 5/20. Weather gloomy. This is about the average range of both the instruments after passing the Waikato towards Taupo. We left this potato plantation, and after about 2 hours' walk, emerged from the wood, and came again on a lot of damp moorish ground, which lasted all the way to Parato, the next settlement we reached. The natives here brought me two very extraordinary plants. One, a gigantic umbelliferous plant, the leaves of which were entirely stiff spines from 4 to 6 inches long, and a curious little ball of scarlet spines, about 1.5 inches in diameter, which I afterwards found to belong to a plant with an almost invisible stem and leaves clinging closely to the ground, so that a careless observer would think that the heads of flowers which he saw scattered about formed the entire plant. I found it to be a new species of Echina, a genus allied to the common burnet. It is a very beautiful and curious plant, which I hope to be able to introduce into English gardens. It was about 10 at night when we arrived at Pirata. This pa is very strongly situate on the top of some perpendicular cliffs, rising from a small stream which runs into Taupo, from which lake it is only about 10 miles distant. The people were not over-disposed to be civil at first, fancying I was only a Pakeha Maori, but when the missionary lads came up they quite altered their tone. It was necessary to make inquiries here about a canoe to take us across Taupo, as Mr. Chapman had before told me there would be a difficulty about it. Next morning, before I was up, the old chief pirate, or the pirate, came to see me. He is the head chief of this pa, and was quite a gentlemanly old fellow. He said there was one canoe at this end of the lake, and that he would send some people to bring it around to the nearest part. He had several children who had curious sandy-coloured hair, which looked very disagreeable. The others had, as usual, black hair, but I could not find out whether they all had the same mother or not. The wife who came with him was a well-looking young woman, about the age of his eldest son, and apparently a great flirt. She took a great fancy to me, so she said, but it was most probably to my blankets. However, she got a new pipe and some of the weed from me in return for her compliments and smiling looks. I found all my men rebellious this morning. They had made up their minds not to stir for the day on the plea of having walked so far on the preceding one. I wondered at their contumacy and got very angry with them, especially when I found that our resting place was only about 10 miles off. So I stormed away for some time, and then proceeded to take more violent measures, at least so far as to lift 1 or 2 of them off the ground and give them a gentle kick behind at the same time, and with a few touches with the strap of my shot belt. I at last got them all loaded and started ahead, threatening all I could imagine in case they did not follow quickly. As I went on ahead with a new guide, I found out the reason for their unwillingness. The old chief had brought them an immense pig for a feast, and as they had already stuffed as much as they could, they wanted to wait till the evening to kill it and have another good feed. I looked back from the top of the hill and saw that they were really on their way, and was satisfied. For when I found out the cause of detention, I feared it would prove too powerful for them to overcome, a pig being as irresistible to a New Zealander as turtle to an alderman, especially when it is to be had for nothing. On reaching the top of a hill, I got the first sight of Taupo, and a splendid sight it was. Much as Mr. Chapman had praised it, its appearance far surpassed his description. Just at the same moment, an opening in the clouds gave me a view of the peak of Tongariro, covered with snow and vomiting forth a dense column of smoke. It was only in sight just long enough for me to ascertain that it lay due south, and I did not see it again in the day during the whole time I was on the lake. My guide and I arrived on the shore of Taupo about 1 o'clock, and after waiting about till 3, I began to get alarmed at the non-arrival of my men. Shortly afterward, a native came to say that we had come wrong and had to scramble along the cliffs at the side of the lake for about a mile, both hungry and angry. To my surprise, I found at the place to which I was led not only my own lads, but the old chief Pirata, with several other men and women and boys. On my inquiring about food, they said the pig would be there soon, which I found to my great surprise to be the very identical one which had caused me so much trouble at Pirata. This was, it must be acknowledged, a most hospitable action on the part of the old chief, not only to provide a feast for us, but when we would not stay to eat it, to send it after us to try us again. I speedily caused the unfortunate porker to be killed without allowing him time to recover his fatigue, and immediately set half a dozen boys and girls cooking pieces of kidney, liver, etc. on sticks over a fire, a method of cooking which at that time I settled in my mind to be much superior than any other for the inside of a pig. I distributed some physic to the natives, and was much amused at the cool manner in which they sucked down the nauseous boluses of rhubarb, aloes, peppermint, and the like abominations, without drinking anything afterwards to wash them down. I was provided with this medicine by the kindness of Mr. Chapman. I found it very useful, as the people were all sickly from influenza, which had been violent among them. The natives are very fond of daubing their heads with a sort of red paint, which they call kokoi. I saw a large manufactory of it on the banks of the Waikato. A double circle of matwork was formed round a large spring of rusty water, and the curdy carbonate of iron was by this means strained off. After this preparation it is burnt and mixed with oil and plastered on their heads and bodies, till they look as if they had fallen into a paint pot. I understand it is going out of fashion, but it is still so common that it is impossible to be carried by a native without getting your clothes daubed all over with the red dirt which has saturated their mats. We embarked on Taupo about 5 in the morning, in a very large tiwai, or canoe, hollowed out of a single log of wood without topsides. Those with topsides, of which they have none on this lake, are called wakor, or in common pronunciation, walkers. This canoe was the largest of the kind I had seen. There were 17 paddlers and about 10 idlers, besides a great quantity of potatoes and my luggage. We had plenty of room, and for the first few miles went on very well. We had to cross a large bay, the only dangerous portion of our journey. Until that was done, I had nothing to complain of in their pulling. After that, they fell off sadly. As the wind almost always blows off the east shore, we kept close under it in case of accidents. The morning was, however, very calm, and the lake as smooth as glass. When we got about halfway through the lake, we had a glimpse of the peak of Tongariro before us, and appearing to arise immediately out of the lake. As we approached the south end, it became again hid by the clouds, which rested on the summits of the lower mountains forming the range. About 11 o'clock we arrived at a village, where we landed to eat. I had not been long there before I was joined by a native called Peter, who had been left by Mr. Chapman to superintend the building of a house which the natives are putting up for him, and which he will use as an outstation to visit every 2 or 3 months, just as the clergymen do in England with their distant flocks. This Peter was a very good native, and quite imbued with the missionary spirit. It was really edifying to hear him read prayers and expound. It was impossible to doubt his sincerity. But I am afraid there are not many such as he, the greater part of the so-called Christian natives being only attracted to become converts by the love of change and the easy mode of life which they enjoy at the missionary establishments. Peter immediately volunteered to go with me to Tongariro, and I was very glad to have him, as he was known to the natives of Taupo as a missionary native, and consequently could answer for my not being a Pakeha Maori, a character the natives hereabouts seemed to hold in great suspicion, owing to the reports of the missionary natives with whom they had had communication, Mr. Peter most likely for one. Had they been more in the habit of seeing white people, they would not have cared much whether they were missionaries or Pakeha Maoris, provided they had plenty of tobacco to give away. After resting an hour at this village, which contained about 500 inhabitants, we set off with the addition to our company of Peter and another native belonging to Mr. Chapman, and a chief, a friend of theirs. In about 2 hours we reached a second and smaller village, where we had another detention, and where Peter wanted me very much to stay the night. However, I was determined not to be prevented from reaching the south end of the lake that evening, and forced them to set off again, although they told me the nearest way to Tongariro was from that village. One of my natives left me here. He had joined at Rotorua, but was not a missionary native, although I found him at the settlement. He was the worst sample of a New Zealander I had met with. I was glad of an excuse for saying he should not go any farther with me. I could have had a dozen volunteers immediately in his place if I had wished it. My boatmen were determined to go no farther than the village at the south end of the lake, for that night at all events, and although it was not 3 o'clock when we started from the last place, and our destination was not 5 miles distant, they took care not to get there until it was just time to pitch the tent. They never vexed me so much before. But their reason for delaying me was that they were afraid if they reached the end of the lake before the evening, I should insist on their starting with me for the mountain that night. They thought it would be much more pleasant to spend it in the village than in the woods, which was just the contrary to my notion. It may not be amiss here to give a description of Taupo, as I am but the second European who has ever seen it, and as it is not likely to again be visited for a long time. My visit having taken place only 3 weeks after that of my predecessor, Mr. Chapman, it is very certain my account of it, imperfect as it will be, must be the only one that has ever reached Europe, and may therefore be considered valuable. Taupo is one of the most superb lakes in the world, not from its size, although that is considerable, but from the extreme magnificence of the scenery surrounding it. Mr. Chapman considers it to be 35 miles long and 20 broad. I do not think it is quite 35 miles, but the width is not overestimated at 20. It is situated in south latitude 39 degrees 35 minutes, east longitude 175 degrees, about. These positions are supposed from the bearings of Mount Egmont as it is laid down in the charts. Mount Egmont is visible from a mountain which rises interruptedly from the lake. The form of the lake is a sort of irregular triangle, with the two most distant angles forming the north and south ends. The western shore is apparently nearly straight, and the third point of the triangle will be about the eastern boundary of the lake. At this eastern angle is a deep bay about 6 miles long, running southeast, which is invisible except almost immediately opposite the entrance. The most peculiar feature in the appearance of Taupo is the immense height of the surrounding cliffs. They are always perpendicular, although in some instances rising in terraces one behind the other, and vary from 500 to 1,000 feet high in several parts of the lake, especially at the north-northwest and northeast sides. These rise perpendicularly from the water to such a height that I never saw their tops through the clouds for about 5 minutes together through the whole time I was on the lake, 8 days. There are but few places where a canoe can land, and at those the beaches are very short and narrow. They are covered with pumice and black sand, and always indicate the entrance of a small stream of water. There are a number of small waterfalls around the lake, but none of any consequence. The only river or stream of any size which runs into it being the Waikato, which runs in at the only part of the lake, the south end, where the banks for any distance are level and the water shallow. At the north end is a very peculiar mountain, with an outline as regular as if it had been a work of art. At the two extremes of the range are two peaks just alike, and each about 1/3 the height of the mountain. At about the distance of another third rise two other equal peaks, and in the centre rises the fifth. I suppose it is about 5,000 feet high. I am not certain that the central peak belongs to the same range as the 4 others. It was undoubtedly considerably farther off, and appeared somewhat bluer than the others. At the south end rose Tongariro, which from this northeast part seemed to overhang the lake. But when we reached the south end, it was invisible, and I did not again see it till after ascending a mountain which cost us 4 hours' hard labour to climb. It does not happen above every other day that one end of the lake is to be seen from the other. At least so the natives said. I saw the two ends at the same time but twice, and each time very early in the morning. Frequently even the east shore is invisible from the west, in spite of its equal height. The cliffs around the greater part of the lake are of a dark greenish colour, tinged sometimes with red, and are basaltic. The fissures are irregular, but run quite perpendicular, and the whole face of the rock presents much the appearance of a mass of common starch, but on a gigantic scale. On the west coast, about the middle, there appears for a considerable extent a dazzling white outline, but I do not know what it is. The natives said it was not a very hard stone. The white cliffs are not so high as the dark ones, rarely more than 250 to 300 feet. There is plenty of obsidian near the lake, and it is cast up on the shore in many places, but I did not see any in situ. The water is of a deep blue colour, appears exceedingly deep, and no weeds growing in it. The river Waikato runs into Taupo at the south-southeast end, and makes its exit at the north. At the place where it enters, it is a small, sluggish river, about 25 yards wide, and from 2 to 4 feet deep. It runs in a very circuitous course through a long line of mud and rushes, forming the only piece of flat land near the shore. On one side of the river, about 2 miles distant, is situate the great pa of Taupo, and on the east side, at about 1 mile from the river, is a small pa called Kotoropo, where I was encamped. There are several other pa's on the west side of the lake and 3 on the east, but not large ones. It is, however, decidedly the most populous place I have seen or heard of in the island. I should think the population of the pa's on the lake could not be less than 5,000. The country around I do not think can be populous. It is too mountainous and bare of wood, and the Maoris only grow potatoes in land which is just cleared, and after about 3 crops abandon it and clear another portion of forest. Mr. Chapman imagines that all the land which is now bare of timber has been made so by this custom of the natives, but I hardly think such can be the case. It has to be taken into consideration that the potatoes have not been grown in the island for more than 50 years. The natives must have been both very much more numerous and industrious to have cleared such a quantity of land in so short a time. Although I do not think the growth of potatoes is sufficient to account for the absence of forest over a great part of the country, perhaps more than half, yet it is certain that wood has decreased, from some cause or other, within no great distance of time, as I constantly found logs and roots lying in the wet ground of the barren moors, where they could not have been brought by any natural causes, and they were too distant from any place where they grow at present, as well as too useless to have been conveyed there. The natives now yearly destroy large quantities of land by their wasteful system of agriculture, and in time there will be no timberland left. This cause has not been long in operation, and is inadequate to the visible effects on the face of the country. Wood is excessively scarce near Taupo, except in places inaccessible, and land fit for the cultivation of potatoes equally so. In a very few years all the wood which now clothes the sides of the ravines and bases of the cliffs will be gone, and the great part of the beauty destroyed in consequence. Even now you see potatoes planted where it is necessary to climb. In fact, on the shores of Taupo, every bit of soil which a man can reach, even at the risk of his neck, is beginning to be planted with potatoes, as they have worn out all the level lands near. Were they to take half the care in the cultivation of the potatoes they do in the kormorā or sweet potato, they might grow in hundreds of places which are now only covered with fern, and are in progress towards becoming barren, owing to the constant fires which the dry nature of that plant causes to spread in a most destructive manner. A person who paid attention to the subject might easily tell how many years had elapsed since the forest was cut down in any particular place, by observing the height of the fern. In the first year after its cultivation for potatoes has been discontinued, the fern springs up to 10 or even 13 feet in height, gradually dwindles down to 6 inches, and at last vanishes altogether. It is then replaced by a short wiry grass, growing in small tufts about a foot apart, with nothing between, and presenting the most desolate appearance. Kotoropo, the village where I encamped, at the south-east end of the lake, is a small place surrounded by boiling springs. The whole side of the mountain at the back is enveloped with steam, escaping from innumerable crevices in the soil. The bushes of veronica and fern plants grow close to these places, do not seem to be affected by the heat, unless they are absolutely touched by the boiling water. The portion of land on the side of the mountain where the springs are most numerous is about 2 miles square, and a great part of it is so covered with springs that nothing grows on it, and it looks as bare as a ploughed field. There are a great many other places on the lake where there are hot water springs, but not so extensive as at this place. I found here that the action of the hot water, which was nearly tasteless, although the vapour smelt of sulphuric acid, converted the compact black lava into clay of different colours, some of it being quite white, other parts mottled with red and yellow. The stones which overhung the hot places were half converted, while the others were as hard and fresh as if they had only been formed yesterday. The lava is hard, black, compact with white grains, strongly resembling greenstone in general appearance and weight. I physicked some more people here, especially an old chief. I was very loath to give this old fellow any, as I did not expect to do him any good. Old age seemed to be his only disease. He was a quiet old man, and was led about by a little girl, I suppose his daughter. I gave him some boluses, and told him how to take them. When I returned, found that he was very much pleased, as he said they had quite cured him. Of what, it would be difficult to say, for when he first came to me his tongue was as clean and his pulse as firm as anyone need wish. His cure quite established my reputation as a physician, and I had innumerable applicants afterwards. The natives were very curious to know what was the use of my collecting so much trash in the way of stones and plants. So I told them that we Pakehas made all the rangwal with which we cured them from these things. But even this did not make them more willing to carry a basket of stones or a portfolio of dried plants, though they would carry twice the weight of tobacco or my tent, which was very heavy, without any grumbling. We set off from Kotoropo on the morning of the 1st of March, and immediately began to ascend a mountain, which the natives told us was the nearest way to Tongariro. After about 4 hours' ascent, we reached a bare place on the top of the mountain, and expected to see the peak momentarily. However, when we arrived at the top, no peak was to be seen, but one of the Taupo natives pointed out another mountain which he said was Tongariro. I was excessively annoyed at having been so deceived, more especially with Peter, who I thought must have known his friends for telling falsehoods. But he declared that he was deceived as well as myself. I was very much puzzled to discover where Tongariro could really be, as the mountain which they pointed out appeared to have no peak. I thought I could distinctly see the top of the hill opposite us, through the vapour on its summit. Between us and the other mountain there was a plain and a lake, but I saw it would be impossible to reach it that day at all events. The worst part of the business was that there was no track to be found down to this lake, and although it did not appear half a mile from us, it took us nearly 3 hours to force a passage to its shores. The greater part of the side of the mountain was covered with the common arborescent veronica of New Zealand, Veronica dismifolia, which, from its never becoming anything more than a bush, impeded our passage much more than a large forest would have done, and besides prevented our ever seeing the lake or mountain opposite, although the descent was always exceedingly steep. Began to think we must be wrong, that we had gone round the side of the mountain instead of directly downwards, but a glimpse of the lake showed my error. Although the lake appeared farther off than it did from the top of the hill, yet it was still immediately beneath our feet. Peter and myself at last reached the open plain in which was the lake, and were soon after joined by the rest of the party. There we found a native who fetched canoes to take us across. At the place where we landed we found a temporary village with about 50 people, very few of whom had ever seen a white man before. They were very civil, and I agreed to stay there till the next day. One of the people promised to go with us to show us the proper way to Tongariro. On the top of the mountain I found several exceedingly curious plants. The only one generally interesting is a Gualtheria, not before discovered, perfectly recumbent on the ground with berries 2 inches in circumference, in great abundance, and very good to eat, as well as beautiful. Like all the other Gualtherias of New Zealand, this plant has a sort of double identity, there being about half the plants bearing snow-white berries, and the others red ones, but not differing in any other particular. They would undoubtedly grow outdoors in England. I afterwards found a third variety, or rather a second species, with pink berries, more beautiful than the red and white ones, but not so good to eat. From this lake, which was called Rotoidi, or Rotoiti, the character of the vegetation entirely changed. The fern on the open land vanished, and was replaced by grass, of which I collected more than 20 species, some of them very good for pasture. The common plantain was also abundant, as it is all over the island, so that if I had not the example of the potato before my eyes, I should consider it indigenous. On the shore of Taupo I found a fine plant of wheat. How it came there, the natives could not tell me, and as undoubtedly Mr. Chapman was the only European who had ever visited the place before, and 3 weeks was too short a time for it to have sprung up and come to perfection, its existence there was very curious. In this little lake there were no fish longer than 2 inches. There were large flocks of gulls, and of the small species of black and white tropic birds which frequent the coasts of New Zealand. There were also, as on all the other fresh waters of New Zealand, abundance of cormorants of 2 species, one very large and black, and the other black and white and small, and plenty of ducks. The wood, which covered one side of the lake, was the only one I ever saw in New Zealand composed entirely of one sort of tree. It was an open forest of totara, and strongly resembled the pine woods of Canada. The trees were not large, but still large enough to make very good tea-wise. Canoes and paddles are always made of this wood on the south side of the Thames. It is more brittle than kauri, but more durable. At this village I saw a woman so very light that she had a perceptible colour in her cheeks. I intended to say to her jokingly that she was a white woman, Wahine Pakeha, not a New Zealander, Wahine Maori. However, she understood me to ask her whether she would be my wahine, i.e. my wife, and immediately came over to the mouth of the tent where I was sitting, and seated herself beside me, to our great astonishment, for all knew that I never allowed any native to come inside the tent. I was still more surprised to find what an easy conquest I had made. I however explained, begging to be excused the honour, as I was a missionary, and missionaries do not marry any but white women. She took it in very good part, which in all probability is more than most Englishwomen would have done in a case of similar disappointment. One great peak of Tongariro slopes up from the lake, but while I was there I could never see the top of it, in consequence of the quantity of vapour always rolling up the side of the mountain from a great many hot springs which are visible on its sides. From one of these a considerable stream of water runs into the lake, but gets cold by the time it reaches it. The side appeared quite barren, with the exception of a small belt of wood about 2/3 up the visible part of the mountain. Rotoiti may be said to be the real source of the Waikato, as the stream which runs out of it is called by the natives. Those which run into it are very insignificant. The mean of 4 days for the barometer gave 28 5/20, thermometer about 56 degrees. End of section 3.